record on this computer? Hey, my name is Lucas Johnson, and I'm going to be talking through the MIS 665 final for the loan cancellations. So here's the honor code, and then moving forward, we took the data and did the info to just check on everything, and we saw initially that there's variables that aren't going to be functioning very well in our data set. So we have borrower category, borrower credit score. We see quite a few, but we're still missing about 50,000 values. But it seems like credit score would be something that's important. So that's something we'll have to keep in mind, along with several other variables down towards the bottom that aren't quite complete. And with describe, we get to see whether or not any of the variables are far outside of the realm of possibility, which was not the case when we evaluated it. Then moving on, we wanted to do some data cleaning. So we checked the is null to look at what values were going to be null that we would have to deal with. So borrower category, again, exposure, we had some empty values. We want to make sure we clean this up before we do any further analysis. So we dropped different variables that we felt like weren't of value, or that I felt like weren't going to be useful to us moving forward, or they had too many null values. In addition, I wanted to figure out a way to handle the borrower credit score to where it could still provide value to us without just removing 95,000 values or removing 50,000 null rows, which seems like too many. And so looking through it, we saw that it's typically centered around 2 to 3, with 4 and 5 still having quite a few values with them, along with another null row within it. So with that, I split the data that was null into borrower credit score category 2 and 3 based off of those being the average values, in addition to dropping the null values that were seen with that. And then once we did that, we could see that the values were really clustered in 2 or 3, but we can still get a lot of value out of seeing what 0 and 1 have versus what 4 and 5 have, to see whether those extremas are doing anything for us. Then I dropped all the null values outside of that, and we can see we have a much cleaner, straightforward data set that we can have action on in the future. Then looking through info, we now have 132,876 values that we can do analysis on, which is really exciting, and I'm glad that we were able to save this many values to be able to look at. Then into exploratory data analysis, I wanted to first get dummy variables for borrower classification. It felt like looking at those different values to see whether potential cancellations were substantial in that regard was going to be important. Then moving into checking on borrower state and canceled, we can see that the most popular states that were being canceled in were in Texas and Louisiana and Minnesota. And then, I mean, on the surface, you could see then, oh, we shouldn't be giving lines to Texas or to those other states. But when you take another look at it and you see the number of people that borrowed money, that top classification is taken up by some of those same states like Louisiana and Texas. But we can have some value out of the data that we get from that, in that California is not in the top 5 for that. However, or in top 5 for cancellations. However, they're top for the number of people that are getting loans. And so you can see with that people from California are less likely to cancel on their loan. In addition, we want to check out Minnesota, a lower bracket of development in terms of number of total registrations, while at the same time having a higher level than most other states on cancellations. So that, again, speaks to the fact that state may not be as reliable as other ones. And that really, and in addition, North Carolina has high registrations but low cancellations. So make another good state like California to share to. Then we can check out borrower credit score on cancellation. And we see that even though we added a ton of values, or 23,000 values to each borrower credit score of 2 and 3, we see that the borrower credit scores of 0 and 1 have a less likely amount of cancellations. And then when we get to 4 and 5, we have over 10% chance of cancellation. So we know that the worse credit score, the more likely of them to cancel. And then moving on to correlation, we can do a little bit of correlational analysis based off of the canceled idea to see, okay, so there's a high correlation between people that are canceling and default charges or borrower IDs, or whether or not they're in transportation and what their APR is. These are just interesting things to see because it sort of talks through the different mean values or different ideas of people on average that are canceling. So then looking at correlation, this looks like quite the mess of a graph, but at the same time, it speaks to whether or not people are going to cancel based off of different ideas. So we have default charges being something that's 20% correlated. Payments received negative 50%, saying that there's a direct inverse correlation between the two of them. And that's something that we can continue to look at as we move forward. I'd like to also point a little bit of attention to the premiums. As we look to predict it, we can see that we have some values that have higher amounts for that. And so that's something that we'll have to keep in mind when we decide to do regression about those variables. And I like to do group buy on cancel just to see on average what people are looking like, whether people that are canceling on average, they have a higher or they have a lower premium than those that aren't canceling. Just different things to keep in mind as we do further analysis. And then on to time series. I wanted to take a look at, depending on the month of people that were registering, whether or not there's higher cancellations on certain months. So we see the differences in mature dates over time just in total, and we see that it goes down towards that September to October area. And that could just be that people are registering more at certain points that aren't aligning with those months. And again, that's seen with checking on the per month basis so we can make sure we're not just guessing off of the graph. It is October, November, or September and October with a slight bump back up in November. And so we can check that against the number of cancellations. And if we just looked at this one, we could see, oh yeah, people are canceling less in September and October. However, when we look at the total registrations, we can see that those align basically directly. So there's not very much seasonality in the data. And it isn't a very big determinant of cancellations, just dependent on time. Into hypothesis testing, I wanted to go over a few different opportunities or a few different things to make sure that we're just really evaluating the data. So hypothesis one, if the APR is higher, the cancellation is more likely. If the number of payments received is higher, the cancellation is less likely. If the loan amount is higher, then the cancellation is less likely. We can see here through cancellation APR, we're looking at a virtually zero value at 6 to the 1, 6 times 1 to the negative 15th, I think was what it was. So basically zero, so definitely a statistically significant relationship. We're looking at cancels versus payment received, and we see a literal zero value. So there is definitely a correlation or a statistically significant relationship between the payments received and the likelihood for cancellation. Lastly, for amount financed and the cancellations, we're looking at 2 times 10 to the negative 17th. So we're seeing, again, 3 for 3 here, statistically significant relationships between amount financed and cancellations. We're going to move on to classification now. Looking at decision tree first, we want to declare our X and Y variables as the idea of just cancellation, everything except for it. And when we run our decision tree, we get an accuracy overall using every single variable of 91.75% with an area under curve of 76%, so not bad. But when you think about every single variable being visualized, this is what it looks like, which really looks insane, but it also will speak to the value of reducing the number of variables that we're dealing with to only a few, because working through a decision tree like this is virtually impossible. However, if we can reduce the number of leaves to 5 or to 3, then we may be able to see something different, and we'll have to see if that impacts accuracy. When we rerun it, it does not impact accuracy. We're still looking at a 91.75% accuracy with 76% under the curve, except for it looks like something that's actually manageable, which really speaks to the idea that while there may be a total of 100 variables that impact cancellation, there really may only be 3 or 4 that actually make substantial impacts on it. And we can use those to really build out models and deploy models that are going to be effective. And then doing K&N, another form of classification. We can see we have a 91.6% accuracy with 75% under the curve, so slightly worse than the decision tree with the more parsimonious variables. And into regression, we want to look with regression at premiums and to say what variables impact the idea of premiums. And when we looked at the heat map for correlation, we could see, like I had mentioned before, that there were a few key variables that were impacting it, at least on a correlational basis. And that was exposure, the down payment, and the finance charges. And so we can use that and try a lasso model to see what's going to work. And we see here we have different variables that are associated with it, which we can convert to sort of like an MX plus B sort of relationship. So we're seeing premiums is 1.314 times exposure plus 1.614 times down plus 33.677 times finance charges. So we can see that finance charges have a substantial impact on the premiums moving forward. And when we do more analysis on that, we have a massive mean squared error, but we have very high R squared. And so this model can still have accuracy. Into random forest classifier, this does the same thing as a decision tree, except for it uses multiple different decision trees to figure out which one is going to work the best. And we can see with that we have 93.63% accuracy, the best so far, and spoiler alert, the best model in general. And when we look at that, we can see which variables are considered most important with the random forest classifier. And those are payments received, borrower ID, and finance charges. And the rest, see, we have tons of variables here, but we're really only seeing, 0.000599 impact by the end of it. So there's tons of variables, but they're impacting them less and less. And we can visualize that as well, that payments received is massive in terms of determining that. And that really goes along with what our decision tree said as well, which the first leaf of it was whether or not the payments received were greater than or less than 8.5. Then moving on to feature selection, we wanted to say which variables are going to actually be the most important moving forward. So we did a k=3 for this and ran this data and got 2, 3, and 8 as the columns that were going to be the most impactful. So we can check here 0, 1, 2, premiums, amount financed, and borrower ID, at least in this model, were going to be the best. However, when we ran it through, we had 83% accuracy and 52% under the curve. So this was actually our worst model overall. And we can do logistic regression saying taking the 5 best attributes to say what are those. And we have them right here. We have premium, amount financed, finance charge, agent ID, and borrower ID as the 5 most important. And then when we run an importance on this, we have payments received being 34%, then borrower ID and default charges. So then we wanted to run this based off of just payments received, borrower ID, and default charges, and we had 91% accuracy with 72% under the curve. So still worse than random forest classifier and the decision tree model that we initially did. Into clustering, we went through and dropped all the binary variables in addition to any variables that had dummy variables associated with. So dropping all the borrower classifications that we had done initially. By doing so and normalizing the data, we were then able to make clusters or 4 clusters based off of that. And that really just tells us information about the overall populace or the overall sort of identities of different people that are either canceling their loan or not. And we can see that we have 4 different clusters of varying sizes that are just dependent on that. And we can see with means, we have a cluster that's not very likely to cancel at all, and they have the highest premium out of any of them, the highest amount financed, the highest finance charges, the lowest APR, highest payments received. And we can see here for places that are more likely to cancel, we're seeing lower payments received, which that is not coincidental. The information that we had done in analysis was telling us that. and then the elbow method to figure out what's the ideal number of clusters moving forward. We had quite the broken elbow here, but we had done initially 4, but there was still more distortion to decrease. So we were able to bring that up to 6 to be able to look at. And we can, and again, redo this with 6 to check on different results. We can further break down the data into even more evenly distributed clusters. And we can find that there's some that are very likely to cancel at 0.17, and the information about them, like the lowest finance charges and the second highest APR while having the lowest payments received. We're finding more and more information that's really going to tell us what is going to be best. And we're seeing the highest average borrower credit score, which aligns well with the cat plot that we had made previously. Managerial implications moving forward. I know this was a ton of data, but there's a lot of value that can really be pulled out of it. And with that in mind, when we evaluate the states, we can say that California has very high registrations with low cancellations. So we may look into expanding more into California with the idea that we're not going to have our loans canceled as frequently. However, we should be cautious moving into Minnesota to say that they have lower total registrations, but much higher total cancellations. So that's just something to keep in mind moving forward. People with credit scores in the 4 to 5 region you should be more weary moving forward, and they're more likely to cancel given the credit scores. In terms of variables that influence premiums, we can look at finance charges, exposure, and the down payments as the primary drivers using the equation that we have below. We can input that data to be able to find what's going to be the distinctions there in terms of premiums, and we can predict it using that. And overall, really, there are a lot of variables that influence cancellations, and I think that's best stated with the decision tree that had the hundreds of different options going down it. However, there's really only a few variables that are going to massively impact that. And through doing the random forest classifier and the decision tree and feature importance, we can say that the likelihood of somebody canceling really comes down to 3 variables with payment received, borrower ID, and default charges. And that can end up predicting the likelihood of someone canceling with 93% accuracy. And all in all, there's different variables that we can be looking at, but if we can pay attention to those and try and have that payments received be above 8.5, we can look at that mean data on the clusters and really study it to say, okay, so this group of people is the least likely to cancel. What does an ideal customer profile look like for us? They have finance charges that sit higher than any other group. They have amount financed that sit higher than any other group. Their premiums are higher than any other group. We can really look at this and say, what is going to be the best strategy moving forward based off of the different clusters that we can put our customers into. And we can use this data to predict what's going on and be able to make better managerial decisions in the future. All in all, I really enjoyed this project, and I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving feedback on this. Thank you very much.